The small community hall was buzzing with chatter and laughter. Chairs scraped lightly against the floor as people found their spots, and the smell of fresh coffee mixed with the faint scent of popcorn from a nearby stand. It was one of those evenings where the whole neighborhood seemed to gather for a little fun, a bit of distraction from the regular grind of life. He stood at the back of the room, leaning casually against the wall, arms crossed. People noticed him, of course. It wasn't hard to notice someone as tall and broad as he was, but he wasn't making a scene. He wasn't boasting. He was quiet, almost blending into the shadows at the edge of the crowd. Yet there was a calm about him, a stillness that made him stand out even more than his size. The event tonight was supposed to be lighthearted, a small talent show organized by the local community center. There were people of all ages ready to showcase something they had been practicing for weeks. Someone had learned to play the guitar. Another person had written a short poem. A group of kids were planning a little dance routine. The atmosphere was filled with excitement, anticipation, and just a touch of nerves. As the previous performer finished and the audience clapped politely, someone leaned over and whispered, half teasing, half serious, "Big guy, you first." A ripple of laughter followed. It wasn't mean-spirited exactly. It was the kind of teasing that happens in a room full of friends and neighbors, where people feel comfortable enough to joke. But the words hung in the air in a strange way. Everyone turned to look at him, curious. After all, the joke implied something, that he was so large, so intimidating, that perhaps he shouldn't be up there at all. He didn't respond immediately. There was a pause, a moment when the room seemed to hold its breath. And then he smiled, just a small, almost shy smile, but enough to stop the chatter and focus all attention on him. The kind of smile that made people lean in without realizing it. He walked slowly toward the stage, each step deliberate, but without any sense of arrogance.
He didn't hurry.
He didn't look around to see how people were reacting. He only carried himself with a quiet assurance that made the room shift slightly in expectation. Some people whispered to their neighbors, "I wonder what he's going to do." Others shrugged, unsure whether to be excited or amused. The stage was modest. A single microphone stood at the center, a small table with a keyboard set up to the side. The lights were soft, warm, and welcoming, but they didn't soften the weight of curiosity that seemed to hang over the audience. He looked at the instruments, then down at the floor, taking a slow, steadying breath. No one in the room knew what to expect, and that uncertainty created an energy of its own. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm and deep, yet gentle. "I'll play something for you," he said. Simple words, but delivered with sincerity. There was no boast, no attempt to hype the crowd, just honesty. The audience leaned forward instinctively. There's something about honesty that draws attention, something about quiet confidence that makes people stop their chatter and listen. Even the people who had been joking moments ago sensed that this performance wouldn't be ordinary. He sat at the keyboard and rested his hands lightly on the keys. For a moment he closed his eyes, almost as if he was taking the room's energy into himself, as if he was remembering something only he could see. Then he pressed the first note. It was soft, tentative, but perfectly in tune. The sound seemed to resonate not just in the room but in the hearts of the people listening. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't meant to impress with speed or complexity. It was simple, honest, and filled with feeling. Each note told a story, of patience, of quiet strength, of experiences that had shaped him into who he was. People began to notice the contrast. Here was a man with a large frame, someone who could easily be intimidating by appearance, yet his hands moved across the keyboard with grace, delicacy, and emotion. The audience started to sit straighter, caught by the unexpected juxtaposition between what they had assumed and what they were witnessing. Whispers floated around. "I didn't expect that." "Wow. Listen to him. He's really good." The music flowed naturally, building slowly. It was clear that he had practiced this piece many times, not to show off, but because it was part of him. And as he played, he didn't just play notes, and he communicated. Each rise and fall of the melody carried feeling, hope, struggle, joy, and a subtle sense of triumph over quiet battles that most people would never see. Some members of the audience felt their eyes moisten. Others simply stared, mouths slightly open, unable to believe what they were hearing. And yet no one wanted to interrupt the spell. There was a collective understanding in the room that they were witnessing something rare, a person revealing a hidden side of themselves so fully, so honestly that it made everything else fade away. At one point, a small child sitting near the front let out a soft, amazed gasp. He looked up at his parent, eyes wide. The parent smiled gently, placing a reassuring hand on the child's shoulder. Even the children in the room seemed to sense the importance of this moment. He continued, fully immersed in his music, closing his eyes at times, leaning slightly into the melody as though the keyboard and he were in a conversation only they could understand. And with every note, the audience's perception shifted. The jokes, the teasing, the playful nudge of "big guy, you first," all of that melted away. It wasn't about size, strength, or appearances. It was about heart, talent, and courage. Minutes passed, though it felt like time had slowed. When he finally lifted his hands and the last note hung in the air, there was a pause. A silence so profound that it almost felt sacred. People weren't sure whether to breathe first, clap first, or even move. Then slowly, as if waking from a shared dream, the room erupted in applause. Not polite, half-hearted clapping, real heartfelt appreciation. People stood, cheered, and some even whistled. The director of the event, who had been observing from the side, shook his head in amazement. "I didn't see that coming," he muttered under his breath, smiling. He stood up, slightly smiling, modest yet proud. There was no arrogance in his eyes, only the quiet satisfaction of someone who had shared a part of themselves without pretense. He looked out at the crowd and gave a small nod, acknowledging their applause but not seeking it. Afterwards, people approached him, shaking his hand, patting his back, and offering words of praise. "You surprised us all," someone said. "That was incredible." Another person added, "I never would have guessed you could play like that." He only nodded and smiled again, soft and unassuming, as if to say thank you. "But I just did what I love." And in that moment, something subtle but profound happened. The room felt warmer, lighter, somehow more connected. People weren't thinking about jokes or assumptions anymore. They were thinking about courage, talent, and the unexpected ways people can shine when given a chance. For him, the experience was life-changing too. For years, he had hidden this side of himself, quietly practicing alone, unsure if anyone would ever notice. He had carried the teasing, the assumptions, the doubts, both his own and those of others, like invisible weights. But tonight, with that first note and the room silent in awe, he realized something powerful. Courage isn't about proving anyone wrong. Courage is simply stepping forward, giving your best, and being true to yourself no matter what others think. And the next time someone teased him, saying, "Big guy, you first," he knew he would smile again, not nervously, not shyly, but with the quiet confidence that comes from knowing the truth. That he didn't have to fit into anyone's expectations. He had a voice, a gift, and a place where it could be shared. The rest of the night passed in a haze of congratulations, friendly chatter, and smiles. But even long after the event ended, people would remember him. The quiet, unassuming man who surprised them all. The one whose performance left the room speechless, and whose courage spoke louder than any joke ever could. Because sometimes, it's the quietest, humblest people who hold the greatest surprises. And sometimes all it takes is one note, one step, one chance to change how the world sees you. After the applause had died down and the hall slowly emptied, he didn't rush to leave. Instead, he stayed behind, sitting quietly on the edge of the stage, letting the echoes of the music and the crowd's reactions sink in. The room was emptying, chairs being stacked, lights dimming, and yet he lingered, lost in thought. People often looked at him and saw only the tall, broad figure, the strong arms, the calm face. But what they didn't know was that there had always been another side to him, one that few ever got to see. This was the side that had guided him through years of quiet struggle, shaped his patience, and reminded him of the simple joys that life sometimes hid behind responsibilities and daily worries. He thought back to his earliest memories of music. It wasn't in any school program, and it wasn't because anyone in his family was musical. In fact, music seemed almost accidental in his life at first. When he was very young, he would hear songs from the radio or piano notes drifting from a neighbor's house and feel something stir inside him, something he couldn't quite explain. The notes seemed to speak directly to him, comforting him on days that felt heavy, exciting him on days that were bright. By the time he was a teenager, he had saved up small amounts of money from odd jobs to buy a second-hand keyboard. He didn't tell anyone at home. He didn't tell friends. It was something private, something sacred. Each evening after chores or work, He would sit by the window in his room, fingers trembling with anticipation, and play. Not to impress anyone. Not to win awards. Just to feel alive. At first it was messy. His fingers fumbled over the keys, hitting wrong notes more often than right ones. But he had patience, and he had a quiet determination that had been with him all his life. Slowly, day by day, note by note, he improved. He discovered he had an ear for melody, for harmony, for expressing feelings that words could never fully capture. There were moments when life made him doubt himself. Bullies at school, people laughing at his quiet nature, others mocking his love for music because it didn't fit the tough image he carried naturally. He remembered one boy at school joking, "Big guy like you play piano?" And laughing so hard he almost wanted to hide forever. But he didn't, he continued. The music was his refuge, his escape, his secret world where judgment didn't matter. As years passed, life became more complicated. Work, responsibilities, family needs, they all demanded time and energy. The keyboard remained, but the hours grew shorter. He sometimes wondered if the dream of sharing his music with anyone outside his small circle would ever happen. Most nights he played alone, content in the knowledge that this gift belonged first to him. Yet even in private he started experimenting. He composed small pieces, mixing melodies he loved with feelings he couldn't name. Sometimes the music was happy, bright like sunlight. Sometimes it was heavy, slow, a reflection of tired days and unspoken worries. Each piece felt like a conversation between him and the world, silent yet complete. Occasionally, friends or family would hear a fragment of his music and stop in their tracks. "Where did you learn that?" they would ask, astonished. He would just shrug and smile, not wanting to explain too much. Music wasn't about recognition. It was about connection. And yet tonight, after that first performance at the community hall, he realized something profound. Connection could happen in public too. Just one performance could reach people in ways he had never imagined. The thought made him both nervous and excited. He felt a spark he hadn't felt in years, the spark of possibility, of hope, of courage. He remembered the teasing comment, "Big guy, you first." At first he would have shrugged it off, let it slide. Maybe he would have walked away entirely, laughed nervously and avoided the spotlight. But something had changed inside him. The years of private practice, of believing in himself even when no one else did, had built a quiet strength. And now, that strength had met opportunity. He thought about the audience, the way their eyes had widened when the first note escaped the keyboard. The way children had gasped and adults had leaned forward completely absorbed. There was something magical in that, not just the sound of the music, but the realization that people could be moved, even inspired by something so simple, so genuine. He also remembered his own nervous anticipation before stepping on stage. Even after years of practice, even after so many solitary performances, he had felt the familiar butterflies in his stomach. It was a strange combination of fear and excitement. But when he finally began to play, when the first note rang out, everything else disappeared. There was no expectation, no judgment, no teasing. Just him and the music and the quiet understanding that this moment belonged to both him and the audience. After the event, he packed his things slowly, allowing the memory of the performance to sink in. He thought about what it meant to share a hidden talent, to reveal a side of himself that few had ever seen. There was a certain vulnerability in it, a risk, but he realized that risk carried a reward far greater than applause or recognition. It was the chance to touch lives, even in a small way. He also remembered something else. Encouragement could come from the most unexpected places. A joke, a lighthearted comment, a nudge from a friend. Sometimes that was all it took to push someone out of their comfort zone. Tonight, that little tease had been the spark. Without it, he might have stayed in the shadows, never showing the world the part of him that had waited patiently, quietly, for years. Walking home later that night, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. Life had never been simple, and opportunities had rarely been easy to come by. But he had learned something important. Hidden talents, long-suppressed dreams, quiet passions, they are never wasted. Even if no one sees them, they matter. And sometimes, when the timing is right, the right moment will come and everything you have carried inside can finally shine. He thought about the people who had been in the room tonight. The parents, children, neighbors, friends, their faces full of surprise and admiration. He realized that their reactions weren't just about him. but about the reminder that everyone has something special inside. Everyone has a story, a talent, a gift that is worth sharing. As he reached his small apartment, he looked at the old keyboard in the corner, the same one that had been with him for years. He smiled softly, remembering all the nights he had spent alone, playing, dreaming, imagining. And now, that keyboard had been a bridge between him and the world, a silent companion that had carried his passion into the hearts of others. He placed his bag down, sat in front of the keyboard, and ran his fingers over the keys lightly, thoughtfully. The notes were familiar, comforting, a reminder of how far he had come. He played softly, letting the melody drift through the quiet room, and for the first time in a long time he didn't feel alone. He felt connected to the music, to his own journey, and to everyone who had been touched by the performance. It was a simple realization, but a powerful one. The courage to share, even when it feels small, can change everything. One small step, one note, one chance can ripple outward in ways you never expect. And for him, tonight had been that first step. He knew this was only the beginning. There would be more opportunities, more moments to share, more chances to let his talent shine. But for now, he simply sat, played, and let the music remind him of a truth he had always carried quietly inside. The strongest people often hide their softest, most beautiful sides, and when they finally reveal them, the world is richer for it. And so, the night passed in quiet reflection, filled with the soft, lingering notes of a man who had learned to be brave, to trust himself, and to let the world hear what he had been keeping safe for so long. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new routines, and new responsibilities. But tonight had been a gift, a reminder that courage and talent, when quietly nurtured, can shine brighter than anyone could imagine. The next evening, the community hall was once again alive with chatter and laughter. People were returning, drawn not just by the event but by the memory of the previous night's surprising performance. Word had spread quickly in the small neighborhood. The big guy who had played the keyboard with such emotion was coming back. Some people were curious, eager to see if the talent they had witnessed was real. Others were skeptical, thinking perhaps last night had been a fluke, a lucky alignment of nerves and timing. But nearly everyone admitted a spark of anticipation, a subtle hope that they might once again witness something special. He arrived quietly, carrying his keyboard carefully, almost as if it were a fragile treasure. He didn't rush. He didn't wave or call attention to himself. Yet even in his quiet entrance, people noticed him. His presence filled the room, not in a loud or demanding way, but in the way someone calm and certain seems to make the world slightly more centered, just by being there. As the event began, performers came up one by one. A young girl with a violin drew soft applause. A small group of teenagers danced awkwardly but with enthusiasm, and a man recited poetry that made a few heads nod appreciatively. Each act was met with polite claps and smiles, but there was an undercurrent of curiosity. Everyone was waiting for him. Finally, someone from the crowd, unable to resist, called out jokingly again, "Big guy, you first." The words were playful, lighter than the previous night, but this time there was no doubt. The audience wanted him to go first because they remembered. They had heard the whispers of his talent. He smiled again, the same quiet, almost shy smile, and walked toward the stage. This time, however, he didn't hesitate. There was a confidence in his step, a calm assurance that came from having faced the fear once before and triumphed quietly. As he settled at the keyboard, the room fell silent. People leaned forward, eager to hear, ready to be moved again. Even those who hadn't been present the night before felt the weight of expectation. They had heard the stories. They had seen the curiosity in the faces of those who had witnessed him. Now it was their turn. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes briefly, and let his fingers rest lightly on the keys. Then he began to play. From the first note, it was clear this was no ordinary performance. The melody flowed naturally, effortlessly, yet with depth that drew the listener in immediately. Each note was deliberate, yet carried a freedom that spoke of years of practice and personal connection. The room seemed to hold its breath, collectively drawn into the music. The piece was longer than the one from the previous night, more complex, filled with subtle shifts in rhythm and tone. Yet it never felt forced. Every part of it carried emotion, joy, sorrow, hope, and resilience. It was as if each note had a story of its own, and as they came together, They told the story of a life shaped quietly, patiently, but profoundly. People who had been skeptical moments ago now sat in stunned silence, eyes widened, mouths slightly open, heads nodding unconsciously to the rhythm. Children stared, captivated, some leaning forward on the edges of their seats. Adults exchanged glances, whispers escaping. "He's incredible. I didn't know someone could play like that. It's beautiful." The more he played, the more the room seemed to transform. Laughter, chatter, and casual conversation disappeared. In their place was a shared connection, an unspoken understanding that something extraordinary was happening. Music had the power to do that, to unite strangers, to awaken emotions that words alone could not reach. As the piece built to its climax, his intensity grew. Fingers danced across the keys with precision and grace, yet never losing the warmth and humanity of the performance. It was clear that he was no longer just playing notes. He was telling a story, one that everyone in the room could feel but only he truly understood. A few people in the audience had tears in their eyes. Some were not crying, but their expressions were soft, reflective, as if the music had reminded them of something they had forgotten or neglected. A memory, a dream, a feeling. Even those who considered themselves tough or practical couldn't hide the impact of the melody. And then came the moment when the room fell completely silent again. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but as the final chord rang out and slowly faded, everyone realized they were holding their breath. They weren't clapping yet. They were absorbing, feeling, reflecting. The silence itself was a testament to the depth of what they had just experienced. Finally, the applause began, hesitant at first, then growing steadily, until the room was filled with a roar of appreciation. People stood clapping, whistling, shouting their admiration. It wasn't polite, it wasn't measured. It was raw, heartfelt, and unrestrained. He had done something rare. He had completely captured the hearts of everyone present. He rose from the keyboard, breathing lightly, smiling modestly, almost shyly, as the audience's energy washed over him. There was no arrogance, no pretense, just quiet pride, the kind that comes from knowing you have shared something truly meaningful. The director of the event, who had been observing from the sidelines, looked genuinely amazed. I don't know what to say," he murmured to a colleague, shaking his head. "I've never seen anything like that, never." People began to approach him, offering handshakes, words of praise, and expressions of gratitude. "You've inspired me," one woman said softly. "I didn't know someone could make music feel like that." Another man admitted, "I came tonight thinking it would be fun, just a little show. But this is something else entirely." He accepted the compliments with humility, simply nodding and smiling. He wasn't performing for recognition. He was performing because it was who he was, because it mattered to him, and now it clearly mattered to others. As the night continued, the conversation around him shifted. People were no longer talking about the other acts as much. They were sharing their thoughts about him, his performance, and the unexpected depth they had witnessed. The teasing words, the joke from earlier, "Big guy, you first," had transformed completely. They were no longer about intimidation or humor. They had become a phrase of admiration, a signal of respect for someone who had defied expectations. Later, when the hall had emptied and the lights dimmed, he stayed behind again. Sitting quietly, reflecting on the evening, he realized something important. His talent had never been about impressing anyone. It had always been about connection, connecting with himself, and now, connecting with the people around him in a way he had never imagined. He thought about the kids in the audience, their wide eyes and innocent awe. He thought about the adults, their tentative smiles turning into admiration. He realized that what he had shared went beyond music. It was a reminder of the hidden potential within everyone, the beauty that can emerge when someone dares to share their true self. Walking home later, the air was cool and calm. The streets were quiet, but his mind was alive with reflection. He thought about his journey, the years of private practice, the doubts, the jokes, the teasing, the quiet moments alone with his music. And he felt gratitude. Gratitude that he had persevered, gratitude that he had taken the chance, and gratitude that people had responded in ways he could never have predicted. For him, the night wasn't just about the applause or the praise. It was about recognition of something deeper, the realization that courage, patience, and authenticity have power. And sometimes the simplest acts, pressing a key, stepping onto a stage, daring to be yourself, can create ripples that touch many lives. And so, as he entered his small apartment, placing the keyboard gently in the corner, he smiled softly. He played a few notes for himself, letting the music fill the room, letting it remind him of who he was and what he had to offer. The world outside would continue as it always did, with routines, responsibilities, and challenges. But tonight had been a quiet revolution, a proof that sometimes the most profound surprises come from the people we least expect. He sat back, exhausted but fulfilled, realizing that this was only the beginning. The journey of sharing his music, of touching hearts, of inspiring others, it had only just begun. And the thought made him feel lighter, braver, and more alive than he had in years. Because sometimes the person who seems quiet, reserved, or even intimidating on the surface can carry a world of beauty inside, waiting for the right moment to emerge, waiting for someone to notice, and waiting for the courage to finally step forward. And when that moment arrives, as it had tonight, it leaves a mark, not just on the audience, but on the performer as well. A reminder that even the quietest, humblest soul can create something extraordinary, something that lingers in hearts long after the music has stopped. The next morning, the neighborhood was buzzing with talk. People who had attended the event couldn't stop sharing their experience. "You have to see him," one neighbor said to another. "The big guy who plays the keyboard? He's incredible." Others nodded, eyes wide, remembering the music that had held them spellbound the night before. Even those who hadn't been there were intrigued. A few people, strangers to him, mentioned hearing about his performance through friends or social media posts. Word had spread quickly, fueled by excitement, admiration, and surprise. A quiet man who had lived in their community for years without drawing much attention had suddenly become the center of curiosity. Meanwhile, he continued his routine, quietly unaware of how much attention he had drawn. He went to work as usual, completed his daily chores, and returned home to practice on his keyboard. For him, nothing had changed, except now, there was a faint sense of possibility lingering in the air, a feeling that the world might be opening a small door for him. Later that week, he received an unexpected message. It was from the director of the community hall event. The message was simple but exciting. "Your performance has touched so many people. There's a music teacher in the city who wants to meet you. He's impressed and believes you have something special. Would you be willing to come by and play?" At first, he hesitated. Meetings like this were outside his comfort zone. He had never considered showing his talent to anyone beyond the small circle of neighbors and friends. But after a moment of reflection, he realized this might be an opportunity to grow, to share more of what he had kept hidden for so long. The following afternoon, he arrived at a small music studio in the city. It was quiet, filled with instruments and sheet music, a place that seemed alive with creativity. The teacher, a man with gentle eyes and a warm smile, greeted him and invited him to play. He sat at the grand piano in the center of the room, feeling the weight of the moment. He closed his eyes, remembering the faces in the community hall, the silence before the first note, the reaction of the crowd, and then he began to play. The music was different this time. It was more confident, more expansive, yet still deeply personal. Every note carried years of practice, patience, and the emotions he had poured into the keys for as long as he could remember. The teacher listened intently, eyes closed at times, nodding slowly, clearly moved. When the final chord resonated and faded, the teacher sat quietly for a moment, as if savoring the sound. Then he smiled. "That was remarkable," he said simply. "You have a gift. But more importantly, you have the heart of a musician. That's something you can't teach. People will be drawn to your music, not because of skill alone, but because of honesty and emotion." For him, the words were both humbling and exhilarating. He had never considered himself exceptional. Music had always been a private comfort, a part of his identity that wasn't meant for recognition. Yet here was someone seeing its value, appreciating it, and encouraging him to take the next step. Over the next few weeks, the meetings with the teacher became regular. He began to explore different techniques, learned to read more complex sheet music, and experimented with composing original pieces. Each session was a discovery, an adventure, and a reminder that there was always more to learn, even for someone who had spent years practicing alone. Meanwhile, his performances at the community hall had caught the attention of local event organizers. Invitations began to arrive for small concerts, charity events, and neighborhood festivals. Each invitation was both exciting and nerve-wracking. He still felt shy about performing in front of larger crowds, but he also felt a growing confidence that came from knowing he could touch people with his music. He remembered the first teasing comment, "Big guy, you first," and smiled. That simple joke had led to a chain of events he could never have imagined. It had nudged him out of his comfort zone, sparked courage, and set him on a path that was slowly transforming his life. At home, he continued to practice daily. Some evenings were long and tiring, yet fulfilling. He experimented with blending different styles of music, incorporating emotions from his personal experiences, and refining techniques suggested by his teacher. His apartment, once quiet and almost empty, now felt alive with possibility, filled with the sounds of discovery and creation. One day, as he was leaving the music studio, a small crowd had gathered outside. Word had spread that someone remarkable was practicing inside. People waved, smiled, and some even asked for a brief performance in the street. He hesitated, then, remembering the impact of his music, agreed. Sitting at a portable keyboard, he began to play. The crowd's reaction was immediate. People paused on the sidewalk, drawn to the melodies that floated through the air. Children danced. Adults closed their eyes to absorb the sound, and strangers exchanged impressed glances. In that moment, he realized how music could break barriers, connect hearts, and bring joy without words. It wasn't long before someone in the crowd approached him with a serious offer, a chance to perform at a larger community festival, one that attracted hundreds of people from surrounding towns. They explained that his story, a quiet man revealing hidden talent, had inspired many, and they wanted him to be part of their event. He was nervous. The thought of performing for hundreds of people was intimidating, but the support he had received from his teacher, the community, and even strangers gave him courage. He agreed. In the days leading up to the festival, he practiced relentlessly. Every day he refined pieces, experimented with new melodies, and imagined the audience's reactions. He thought about the people who had laughed at the idea of him playing music and the ones who had encouraged him silently. He realized that every note he played was more than music. It was a reflection of his journey of patience, courage, and persistence. Finally, the day of the festival arrived. The stage was much larger than any he had experienced before. Bright lights, a sizable audience, and the hum of anticipation filled the air. He felt a familiar nervous flutter, but also a sense of purpose. This was his chance to share everything he had carried inside for years. As he took his place at the piano, he remembered all the moments that had led him here, the quiet evenings at home, the first hesitant notes, the teasing joke that had pushed him forward, the encouragement of his teacher, and the awe of the community hall audience. Each memory strengthened his resolve. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and began to play. The music soared. It was richer, more confident, and deeply moving. Every note resonated with emotion, capturing the hearts of everyone in the crowd. People were silent, listening intently, some with tears, others with smiles that refused to fade. By the end of the performance, the applause was overwhelming. People cheered, clapped, and called out his name. He stood humbled, smiling quietly as he realized the truth. Sharing his hidden talent had not only transformed his own life, but it had also inspired and moved countless others. That night, as he returned home exhausted but fulfilled, he understood something profound. Life often hides its most beautiful moments behind fear, doubt, or hesitation. But when someone dares to take a step to reveal a hidden gift, the impact can ripple far beyond what they imagine. For him, the journey was far from over. There were still challenges, still opportunities to grow, and still music to explore. But he now knew something invaluable. Courage, patience, and the willingness to share oneself can lead to unexpected, life-changing experiences. And so as he sat before his keyboard that evening, the room quiet, music filling the space, he smiled softly. He had discovered something deeper than applause or recognition. He had discovered the power of believing in oneself, of embracing hidden talents, and of sharing them with the world. Months had passed since that first unforgettable performance at the community hall. His life had changed in subtle but meaningful ways. People began recognizing him on the streets, sometimes asking for a quick melody or words of encouragement. Invitations for small events continued to arrive, and with each performance he grew more confident, more at ease in sharing the music that had been hidden for so long. But the biggest opportunity of his life was still ahead. A regional music festival, known for discovering hidden talents and bringing them to national attention, had extended an invitation. The festival organizers had heard about him through the community, his teacher, and even news outlets covering local stories of inspiring people. For the first time, he would perform in front of a crowd larger than he had ever imagined, and the thought both excited and terrified him. For weeks leading up to the festival, he practiced intensely. Every day he would sit at the keyboard for hours, experimenting with new compositions, refining old pieces, and imagining the reaction of a vast audience. Each note was carefully chosen, every melody shaped by years of personal experience, hope, and quiet determination. Yet, despite all the preparation, doubt sometimes crept in. "What if I fail?" he whispered to himself during late-night practice. "What if I'm not as good as they expect?" But he would pause, take a deep breath, and remind himself of the journey so far. The community hall, the street performances, the encouragement from his teacher, and the countless moments where music had saved him from doubt and fear. Finally, the day of the festival arrived. The venue was massive, with hundreds of seats filled with eager spectators, reporters, and judges from across the region. The energy was electric, a mixture of excitement, anticipation, and nerves that made the air feel alive. Backstage, he felt the familiar flutter in his chest. The keyboard awaited him, a familiar companion, yet somehow more intimidating in this grand setting. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and let memories of his first performance flood his mind. The joking words, "Big guy, you first." The wide eyes of the community hall audience, the tears, the smiles, the sense of connection. When his turn arrived, the announcer's voice called him to the stage. He walked forward with measured steps, holding his head high but feeling the weight of thousands of eyes upon him. The lights were bright, the audience buzzing with curiosity, and for a moment the noise felt overwhelming. Then, he sat at the keyboard, fingers poised over the keys. He closed his eyes once more, letting calm wash over him, and then he began to play. From the very first note, the audience was captivated. The melody was beautiful, layered with emotion, flowing effortlessly yet carrying a depth that left listeners breathless. Every chord, every pause, every subtle change in rhythm spoke of a life shaped by quiet perseverance and deep feeling. People in the audience leaned forward instinctively. Some had tears in their eyes, while others whispered softly to companions about how moving the music was. Even seasoned musicians in the crowd nodded with approval, recognizing the rare combination of technical skill and heartfelt expression. As he played, he remembered all the moments that had led him here, the shy practice sessions at home, the hesitant steps into the community hall, the laughter and teasing that had pushed him forward, the encouragement of his teacher, the growing admiration of his community. All of it had built to this moment. The piece continued, building slowly, then soaring, then softening again, taking the audience on a journey that seemed both personal and universal. He felt a connection with every person in the room, a shared understanding that transcended words. Music had the power to do that, to reach hearts, to evoke memories, to inspire and heal. When the final chord lingered in the air, the silence that followed was profound. Hundreds of people sat still, absorbing the experience, not yet ready to break the spell. And then slowly applause erupted, first scattered, then growing into a wave of sound that filled the entire venue. People stood, cheering, clapping, some shouting words of admiration. The energy was overwhelming, a mixture of joy, amazement, and respect. He stood from the keyboard, hands slightly trembling, smiling quietly as the audience's response washed over him. This wasn't about fame, prizes, or recognition anymore. This was about connection, the ability to move people, to inspire, to show that even the quietest, humblest person could create something extraordinary. After the performance, the judges approached him, expressing admiration and interest in his journey. Some offered opportunities for recordings, mentorships, and collaborations. Others simply wanted to meet him and understand the story behind the music. Every interaction reminded him of the power of courage, of taking the first step, and of believing in oneself even when the world seemed indifferent. Backstage, he was approached by one of the festival organizers who said, "Your story, your music, it's more than talent. It's hope. You've reminded people why they believe in dreams." He nodded, feeling the weight of the words. For so long he had doubted himself, kept his music private, and wondered if anyone would ever care. Now, in this moment, he realized that courage and persistence had led him to a place where his hidden talent was no longer hidden. It was celebrated, appreciated, and shared with thousands. That evening, he returned home exhausted but fulfilled. Sitting quietly with his keyboard, he reflected on the journey. He thought about the teasing words, the initial doubts, the first hesitant notes, the growing confidence, and the overwhelming support he had received from strangers, friends, and mentors alike. He realized that the journey wasn't just about music. It was about life. It was about taking risks, stepping into the unknown, and trusting that your authentic self has value. His talent had opened doors, but it was his courage, his persistence, and his willingness to share that had truly made the difference. In the days that followed, invitations continued to arrive. Interviews, performances, and collaborations. Opportunities he had never imagined were now within reach. But despite all the attention, he remained grounded, remembering the simple truth that had guided him from the very beginning. Music was a gift to be shared, not a tool for ego or validation, and so, he continued to play, sometimes for crowds, sometimes for friends, sometimes alone in the quiet of his apartment. Every note carried the weight of his journey, the joy of discovery, the lessons of patience, and the power of persistence. Every melody was a reminder that life's most extraordinary moments often come from the courage to step forward, to reveal what is hidden, and to embrace the unknown. Looking back, he thought of the first time someone had joked, "Big guy, you first," and smiled. That simple moment had been the catalyst, the spark that ignited a chain of events that changed his life forever. From that tiny spark, a flame had grown, one that illuminated not only his path, but also the hearts of those who listened, shared, and believed. And in the quiet moments, as he played alone, he understood the greatest truth of all. Talent is powerful, but it is courage, authenticity, and the willingness to share oneself that create a lasting impact. The big guy who had once been overlooked had found his voice, and in doing so, had reminded the world that extraordinary beauty often lies where we least expect it.